Hello and good morning, and welcome to your morning briefing for Friday, the 28th of February, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. I want to thank everyone, all the Early Warning Network members, for getting those 2025 member surveys in. Extremely helpful, especially when you see some of the same stuff come up. So we're going to get that stuff fixed. Also, thanks for telling me what's going right. We really appreciate it, and we will roll out a plan and let everyone know what's changing coming up here in the next week or so. All right, with that, let's go ahead and jump into this morning's report to start off inside the Beltway. Robert, so Trump has announced that he is going to, or at least wants to, double this 10% tariff to 20% tariff. Is that correct on China?
Correct. And he's also said yesterday when he made that comment that the 25% tariffs against Canada and Mexico are still on track to take effect next Tuesday.
Mm-hmm. Well, this seems to be important for a number of reasons. Number one, Robert, you said that 80% of all U.S. auto parts come from Mexico and Canada, correct?
Correct. That's from my understanding that, the imports of parts it's like about 80%.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah. And the auto manufacturers have also brought that up and apparently been complaining about that. All right. Here, one other thing I want to cover. I saw someone mention this, and I don't know how true it is. I want to get your take on it. This guy said that these Trump tariffs on Canada and Mexico are obviously going to be withdrawn. But when Trump enacts tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China at the same time, he can come back and retract these Canadian and Mexico tariffs, leave the China tariffs, and that way he can implement tariffs on China without singling them out specifically at a single time. What's your take on that?
I think that's a possibility. I saw that there was a White House official who said that there could still be a deal to delay these Canada and Mexico tariffs. And apparently Trump's like privately disappointed with what they've been doing, the actions they've taken on fentanyl and immigration. So I think he's still open to rolling back those tariffs. And we could see him do that and then leave this 20% tariff on China and possibly even another 10% increase in the future.
Mm-hmm. All right. Let's move on here. We've seen a lot of federal cuts from the federal budget. Apparently, Republicans want to go after SNAP next. What's going on?
Yeah, this is Agriculture Committee Chair Glenn Thompson. In this budget reconciliation bill we've been covering, it mandates certain government cuts, and they asked the Agriculture Committee to cut $230 billion from ag spending, and this lawmaker wants to target SNAP and make that $230 billion cut over the next decade. He did say that they're going to focus these cuts on errors and waste, but I just don't think there's $230 billion in error and waste that they could cut directly just from SNAP. And this stood out to me because we've talked a lot about how the current economic conditions and social conditions are not the same as 2020. So when we're talking the Trump resistance, there's not a lot of ground for something like the 2020 summer riots. But I think this is, over the long term, something like this could increase economic pressure that might start to create those conditions, going forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do share that concern. One other thing, Robert, before we move on, RFK Jr. was talking about removing things like soft drinks and cheesy poofs from SNAP and EBT. Is that still on the table?
As far as I understand.
Okay. All right. The next item is amazing to me. The train thefts, the organized cargo thefts from trains is not only at a decade high, it's in the billions of dollars, like tens of billions of dollars. Robert, what is this?
So there's a hearing yesterday in the Senate, and Senator Todd Young from Indiana, he said that cargo theft in the U.S. has hit a decade high since COVID. And a couple of interesting points he made. One of them is that it now includes a lot more sophisticated cargo theft coming from international groups from China, Eastern Europe, and Mexico. And Department of Homeland Security says that we're now at $15 to $35 billion of loss annually. This map was the most recent one I could find from CargoNet. They're a risk analysis firm for cargo theft. And this is already back prior to COVID. you can see where a lot of these hot spots are. And most of the witnesses in this hearing were actually from Texas and talking about Texas specific issues with organized crime.
Mhm. All right. So I'm seeing a lot of ports there. So we got Los Angeles and Long Beach. We got New York, greater New York, New Jersey area, and then Houston down there as well, Miami, Fort Lauderdale. Did they talk about where these organized rings are they concentrated in any certain area? Specifically the foreign one, because what did you say? There's Chinese, Eastern European, and Mexico organized crime rings. Did they talk about where they are operational?
Well, they didn't say, what countries specifically, other than China and Mexico. They did point to Russia as being one major source. In a lot of these witnesses in the industry, including some law enforcement officials, they said that what they would find on the domestic side of this cargo theft is that a lot of these different rings, there might be 8 different individuals involved in different cargo thefts. They'll use an address, all the same address. When they go to investigate, they've vacated. They'll find another new address, and so they're moving around on the domestic side a lot too.
Mm-hmm. All right, interesting. Thanks for that, Robert. Let's move on to the rest of our roll-up items here. Starting with the Government Accountability Office. Go ahead, Robert.
The GAO, they released a report yesterday, and they said the Department of Defense is struggling to apply innovations to major strategic challenges. And something else they pointed out, interestingly, is that the DoD stood up this agency called the Defense Innovation Unit. And the idea was they would sit in Silicon Valley and kind of rake up all of these tech innovations. And they said that unit does not even have clear insight into whether they're making progress. And they also pointed out something that we've hit on a lot, is that the Navy, when we're talking shipbuilding issues, they have not coordinated spending or even taken a strategic approach toward it. And the Navy does not even have an industrial base strategy right now.
Mm-hmm. I have something to add here. I moved to Austin a decade ago, roughly. And we were working on a tech project at Ford Observer. And so I was in a tech accelerator. And in that same tech accelerator, they had DIUX, which was Defense Innovation Unit Experimental. So this was before it became an official program of record, before they're testing things out. So it's not just in Silicon Valley. I think they're up in Boston, Austin as well. Austin is also now home to the U.S. Army Futures Command. Robert, the Futures Command was supposed to take care of these problems. Essentially, you have this whole command focused on trying to figure out what the future of warfare looks like, and then translate that into requirements for the defense industrial base to begin production on. Is there any, we've talked a lot about Elbridge Colby and some of the other people coming on at the DoD. Is there any indication that the Trump administration or the Pentagon is going to figure this stuff out before it's too late?
I haven't seen anything specific come out of the White House, but I will point out that when a lot of this was happening over the Biden administration, it just seemed to me like there wasn't necessarily a coherent grand strategy coming out of the White House. And you need that to decide on what you need to look at, what kind of technology developments you need to take up, and where a lot of these developments need to go. And I do think it's a good sign that we're seeing the Trump administration bring in a lot of people who do have a coherent idea about where American grand strategy should go. So I'm sure we will see Trump administration officials address, this issue of these agencies that are supposed to be innovating, not even knowing if they are being successful at taking up these technological developments.
Mm-hmm. I would just note DIUX was stood up in 2015. So they've been at this a decade now, and apparently there still is no strategic approach. I think it's a fantastic idea. And just a little bit of background. They are supposed to be looking at tech development from the startup phase, looking at new innovative technology, figuring out how they can take private tech development and apply it towards military national security purposes. That's the overarching goal of the Defense Innovation Unit, and 10 years old, still no strategy. All right. Thanks, Robert. Let's move on to Virginia. This is very interesting. Go ahead.
Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin said yesterday he's going to issue an executive order, and he's going to direct Virginia State Police. They're going to stand up a task force that's going to be trained and deputized by ICE. And he's also directing their corrections department to cooperate with ICE immigration efforts. Also, part of this order is going to direct Virginia law enforcement officials and sheriffs across the state to certify that they're cooperating with ICE. And I thought this was interesting because prior to Youngkin's election, I think it was 2018, Virginia has been fairly blue when it comes to elections, statewide and federal elections. And that started this path down Virginia turning more purple. And I think it's interesting that he is coming out and saying that they're going to cooperate with immigration efforts. And it might be even a sign of where Virginia is going politically.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to come back to this, Robert, in just a minute when we talk about low intensity conflict, because I think some areas in Virginia are like really, really prime areas for escalation, especially against ICE. Thanks for that, Robert. Let's move on to Jared. Looking over to Taiwan, we've covered this quite a bit. How Chinese students go to Taiwan and they act as influence agents. They gather intelligence, and now apparently that's coming to an end.
Absolutely, there's the Taiwanese are trying to bring it to an end. So the Ministry of Education there banned all exchanges with 7 of China's top universities to, quote, protect Taiwan's core technologies and research achievements. Basically, they're accusing China of just stealing all of their technology. Mm-hmm. And moving over to Israel, the Israeli Defense Forces first inquiry into the Hamas attacks on October 7th claimed that they underestimated the threat from Hamas because they were focused on Hezbollah and Iran instead. The IDF denies that any reallocation of military forces away from Gaza was in a political nature, which I found interesting because that's not a thing to just have to say.
Well, I think that was the claim. I think the claim was maybe Netanyahu wanted this to happen to give. I hate, it's not like he needs a pretext, but to give a very clear, direct reason why we're going to level Gaza. I mean, that's what they said.
Okay. All right. Then over in NATO this week, NATO announced it would field unmanned surface vessels. They're currently on the water right now in the Baltic region and integrate them into a Baltic Maritime Task Force. Danish and German naval ships have already been conducting maneuvers and live fire drills with these drones. And the alliance intends to enhance undersea cable security with these drones integration, which it sounds like they're going to move right from testing to integration. Mm-hmm. Then kind of staying over in that region, Estonia is doing something particularly interesting. They're developing a national drone defense network, and Estonia is very, very small. So this is going to operate on a very small scale. Now, what they intend to do here is have a common command and control that's AI enhanced for 24/7 monitoring, and then integrate commercial detection devices into it, along with their defense detection devices. And I think this is interesting because I really wonder if, being due to the size and what they intend to do, if it could be scaled down to something like private businesses or maybe even larger private ranches having a drone defense capability of their own, because they're being that everything is commercially available for what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. On that topic, Jared, quick question: Are they counter drone weapons? There's I guess several different types. Are there any details about exactly what they're doing? Like, are they doing directed energy? They're shooting these things down with nets, the jamming, the communications. What are they doing here?
They just announced this, so they haven't put out any details on what exactly they intend to do. But being that drone defense is very similar to what I used to do, I was integrated there in missile defense. You need soft kill, so jam it, and you need hard kill in order to be effective. That's shoot it down. I would assume it's a combination of both. And there was actually just a major arms exhibition over in Europe this week, and they had a lot of anti-drone hard kill technology coming out. So I think we're going to see a lot of proliferation of that.
Mm-hmm. All right. I remember back at Black Hat every year, there'd be some new shotgun round with a net or with fishing line or something in it. And people were like, yeah, you just get your shotgun out and shoot these things down. Okay.
Actually, on that note, a shotgun was one of the ones that was made, and they even developed a special sight so that rather than having a dot that you have to try to line up with a black dot, you have a ring that's drone shaped to catch your drone and then fire. And it had tungsten pellets inside so that it would provide extra penetration power, which I found incredibly interesting because it's a specialized shotgun for it.
Mm-hmm. All right. I don't think those have been too effective, but keep working on it, I guess. All right. Thanks, Jared. We're going to move on now to our warning items, starting with this new strategy. This was interesting to me. There is a militant left-wing and essentially a revolutionary anarchist blog, and they proposed a new strategy for what they call the quote-unquote rudderless left. And this new strategy includes escalation, direct action against the Trump administration. And this article explains that protests are insufficient because they are symbolic. They're no longer effective. Like, protests don't work against a fascist authoritarian government. That's what they're saying. And therefore, a new strategy of disruption is required. We've been hearing this message for several years now. Well, really going back to 2016, protests don't work. You have to push direct action. This is absolutely where the left is headed. This is directionally where they're going. This new specific strategy calls for direct intervention against government operations, and they're calling for things like roadblocks, strikes, and also disrupting the U.S. economy. And this is important because we've covered this before. Back in 2020, there was this map in a whole pamphlet called Choke Points in a Fragile Network, or maybe Choke Points in a Fragile Economy. And it was all about how activists and militants could shut down ports, shut down rail hubs, shut down commercial shipping facilities to essentially attack this economic warfare, attack the U.S. economy. And this was their plan. If Trump had stayed in office legitimately or illegitimately after the 2020 election, then this is absolutely what they're going to unleash on the United States. So I thought that was interesting. This is being brought up again. This is something that you would see in a color revolution, for instance, or some form of popular revolution. The strategy also calls for enhanced security measures, such as using encryption and also developing new communications networks that exist off traditional platforms, because they say they're harder targets for surveillance, which is also true. The activists, or this militant blog, also recommends that the anti-Trump resistance turn their communities into quote-unquote hostile territory in order to raise the cost for the presence of law enforcement. And they want to reject slogans and reject these media campaigns in favor of organizing at the hyper-local level and developing their neighborhoods as hotbeds for resistance, especially in places where two things are already happening. Number one, especially in neighborhoods that already oppose the Trump administration, so they have high levels of support there for their cause. And then also in areas where local organizations can work towards replacing these funding cuts for social services that we have been seeing from the Trump administration. Finally, the strategy calls for an examination of state weakness. And they're referring to the Trump administration and the federal government. They want to understand that weakness so that it can be exploited to disrupt government operations such as ICE enforcement or cause friction. And the article rhetorically asks questions like how militants can, quote unquote, map out government operations and then identify where those operations can be interdicted. So this is not the first strategy proposal that I've seen calling for escalation. It is one of the better ones that I've read. And again, the underlying assumption, which is 100% accurate, protests don't work. And their logical conclusion is that we need to escalate. We need to be more disruptive and potentially get into the realm of political violence. One thing we've seen so far, the main thing we've seen so far from these progressive activist groups, is organizing for mass political protest. And that is a goal for which so far they are failing. We have not seen any mass political protests. These protests still number in the dozens, maybe low thousands. And we really haven't seen anything that I would call mass protests. On the other hand, this strategy, which is not a progressive strategy, this is a revolutionary strategy, mixes elements of nonviolent civil resistance with irregular warfare. So they're talking about things like building parallel networks and using autonomous action to disrupt government operations. A brief point on that. Autonomous operations are where small individuals and small groups do not have any kind of command structure. They don't answer to anyone. probably not two, but one person or maybe 5 or 10 people get together, maybe 20 people get together, and they say, well, what do we want to do? Okay, let's go do it. And there's no command, there's no authority, there's no one directing them. It is completely autonomous. So instead of looking at an army, so we've got 50,000 people in this army. It's really more like, well, you've got like 5,000 cells of 10 people apiece or something like that. So it's much more difficult to defend against. And this article is all about how these progressive organizations are trying to build these hierarchical structures. So you have a local chapter of a protest group, and then you have a state chapter of a protest group, and then you've got this national protest movement, which is centralized authority, essentially, that's giving these people a strategy. So they take that and they say, well, let's make everything flat. Let's make everything horizontal. There's no command structure. This is a far more, this is going to take a lot more to catch on. But once it does catch on, it is much more difficult to defend against. It's much more difficult to map out, much more difficult to surveil, much more difficult to disrupt. Again, because you're not dealing with one organization of 50,000 people, you're dealing with 5,000 organizations of 10 people. The last point I really want to drive home here, or maybe 2 points. One of the biggest failures from the 2020 anarchist insurrection was a lack of lasting change. In all the postmortems that I've read of the Antifa types and the far left revolutionaries, they all said, hey, it was fun. We got to go out and fight cops and burn down a police precinct, but it didn't really change anything, which is true. And you can actually argue that it backfired because Trump was elected again 4 years later. This particular strategy, if it were to catch on, if it were to gain mass adoption, and I do think that's a big if, it would need to be refined and expanded in order to be effective and also in order to avoid a similar failure. Because these proposed tactics, things like roadblocks and strikes, they've been proposed for years and they really haven't caught on. But this would cause short-term disruption to U.S. economic activity. It would cause friction for the federal government, for the Trump administration, for ICE, for all these federal operations. But there's no stated plan for any kind of long-term viability or success. And so I see this plan maybe being successful in the short term, but probably failing in the long term in a situation where President Trump does have legitimacy and also large popular support for large parts of his agenda. I might have more, coming up today at 10 a.m., we're going to do our Friday roundtable. And I may expand this just a little bit more and compare it to some other recent low intensity conflicts. But directionally, bottom line here, this is where we're headed. We're headed at some point from protests to more violent forms of disruption. This is something I started saying back in November of last year. The Trump resistance was going to be smaller, but potentially more violent. We have not yet gotten to the more violent part. Although one individual, it was a man who is publicly showing as a female, was arrested for apparently trying to burn down, or I didn't see exactly what this individual was arrested with, but a Tesla dealership, trying to start a fire, something like that. This is also something I covered 2 weeks ago, the potential for that to happen. All right. And so at any rate, I may expand on this a little bit more and do a compare and contrast on today's roundtable. That's coming up at 10 a.m. Central Time. And with that, let's go ahead and move on to our next warning item. Robert, thanks for standing by. We're still up against potentially a partial government shutdown on the 14th of March. What's going on?
Yesterday, President Donald Trump, he put out a Truth Social post saying he supports a continuing resolution through the rest of the fiscal year to avert a shutdown. And from what I understand, the Senate appropriators are already starting work on a bill to do just that. But something stood out to me that I saw. There apparently senior Republicans and some White House officials are talking about including permanent cuts made by the Department of Government Efficiency in this stopgap spending bill, and basically forcing Democratic lawmakers to vote against these cuts. And I think this potential strategy that Republicans in the House and Senate could do might push us into a partial government shutdown, because Democrats are still on their side pushing for these guardrails against the Trump administration to be included in any kind of spending bills or continuing resolution. And meanwhile, Republicans will need Democratic votes to pass any bill, whether it's the full spending bills or stopgap, to avert that shutdown. And if GOP does go forward with this strategy, I think it could push Democrats to maintain that united front that they're trying to create against Trump and the GOP and kind of stumble us into a shutdown.
Mm-hmm. Robert, I've been thinking about this for the past couple of weeks, and I think some of the conventional wisdom says this would be bad for Democrats. A government shutdown would be bad for Democrats, even though they say Republicans would own this because Republicans control the House and the Senate. They have very slim majorities. I'm going to take the opposite argument here and say a government shutdown would be bad for Democrats. It'd be far worse for the Trump administration, and I think that's what you want. I think you just want to continue the chaos for Trump because you have to get voters angry and you have to agitate them. Remember, Democrats' intermediate goal is taking back power in the House and the Senate in 26. 2 years of constant fiscal and congressional dysfunction and disruption might help them achieve that. What are your thoughts?
I agree. And I think that's how the Democrats perceive this fight going on right now, is that it would benefit them politically in the midterms, because like every shutdown, since the beginning of the first Trump administration, they've labeled it as Republican shutdown or Trump's shutdown. I think is exactly the avenue that they could go for this to try to gain a political leverage in the midterm elections.
Mm-hmm. Last note here. One of Trump's big problems, and he's facing internal opposition from some Republicans in the House and Senate. Is it the Freedom Caucus? Which Republican faction is against all this stuff?
It's the Freedom Caucus. They're the ones that oppose a lot of the continuing resolutions and not having more spending cuts in these bills.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, I mean, this seems like if they vote against a continuing resolution or they vote against some of these bills, it seems like it's a pretty easy slam dunk for Democrats to say, hey, this is how bad this is. Republicans aren't even for this. All right. I don't want to get into the political weeds of the Democrats, Republicans. We do that enough, but let's move on here. Thanks for that, by the way, Robert. All right, Jared, let's talk about our last item of the day. Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum. She's been continuing these La Mañanera things, these daily morning press conferences that AMLO has done. And I guess in yesterday's press conference, she said that these fentanyl precursors are coming from foreign countries. What are they?
Yes, they're coming from China, the U.S., and, quote, some other Asian country. Now, Sheinbaum also called for further cooperation with the U.S. to monitor the entire fentanyl supply chain. Looking at this from the foreign policy view, I think Sheinbaum likely means India is the other foreign country. As you can see here from the DEA, India basically is the other foreign country that would actually produce these. They import them into Mexico. There you can see actually it's in southern Mexico. Mm-hmm. Now, with that being the case, Trump could potentially threaten additional tariffs on India in order to persuade them to reduce fentanyl precursor traffic.
Mm-hmm. Is this organized crime? I mean, you can look at China and say, okay, well, this is like probably a nationally directed effort to cause problems for the United States. I don't get that feeling from India. What is it money making thing, or why are the Indians sending fentanyl precursors into the United States and Mexico? I don't know. I thought Jared was just thinking. Apparently he's frozen. All right. Well, I don't know. Maybe we can track that down. Thanks, Jared. All right. We are going to get to a couple of questions, but we're going to save some questions also for today's roundtable because I want to get Max's take on some of this stuff as well. There's one question from Frozen Nomad I want to get to, which is, with the recent downturn in the stock market and crypto, are there any economic danger signs in the United States or abroad that hint at systemic issues as opposed to normal market activity? Yes, I would say generally we are seeing mixed economic data. I read not all, but I read a bunch of investment research reports from Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that I think it was in Monday or Tuesday's report, Bank of America does a monthly global fund manager survey, and they pick 300 fund managers. So these are institutional investment funds, hedge funds, mutual fund managers, and they ask them a series of questions. And it is a snapshot in time, but it is a really good reflection, I think, of what fund managers are seeing. And right now, all the big banks are saying we're going to have maybe 2% economic growth. Basically, they're not saying that recession is likely or near. The fund managers are also not seeing that. And I don't want to look at that and say, well, this is proof positive. We're not close to a recession or we're not close to anything. However, I think it was like 6% of global fund managers in this survey, the February survey, said they expect a recession. So 80% say they don't expect a recession in the next 12 months. I take that as a data point. I think it's a good data point. And certainly that's not to say that they're infallible or they have a crystal ball or they know authoritatively that we will or won't have a recession. But I just look at that and I think sentiment is much higher. But especially on social media, I continue to see the doom saying we're going to have a market crash and economic collapse and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So just very briefly, that's my answer. I can probably go into some more indicators and talk about some of the things that I've seen that probably are cracks forming, especially on the financial side. I mean, market concentration has been a huge thing. There's been basically the Magnificent Seven have been driving the returns for the stock market. So there's a massive amount of concentration in a very low number of stocks. And so I think that's a problem. But that's my answer. Maybe I can give you a better answer here in a couple hours. All right. The rest of the questions we're going to save for today's roundtable. Again, it's coming up at 10 a.m. Central Time, right here, wherever you're watching this. We're going to be back at 10 a.m. Not only answering your questions, but each analyst is going to go around and talk about their big thing for the week. I'll answer these questions and a lot more. Everyone, that's going to do it for today's morning briefing. Thanks so much for watching. And we'll be back in your inbox on Monday. Back on the morning briefing on Monday at 8 a.m. Central Time. Catch us for the roundtable coming up in an hour and a half. So until then, be well and stay out front.